back for our second lesson about the Great Depression. Now that we've learned about the start of the Depression, it's time to explore what life was like for everyday Americans during this very difficult time. Here's who we're going to study. We'll start off by looking at families. Then we'll move on to farmers and an event we call the Dust Bowl, which was not a football game. We'll talk about labor unions, veterans, and a group of veterans known as the Bonus Army. We'll finish by talking about what President Hoover did to try to help people, why movies were so popular in the 1930s, and finish with the story of the presidential election of 1932, when Hoover, spoiler alert, lost his job. We're going to start off by talking about the way the Great Depression affected different groups of Americans, and we'll begin by talking about families. Fewer people got married in the 1930s than in the 1920s, and not as many babies were born in the 1930s. Children, women, people who were not white, and working class people suffered the most. Parents often sent their children out to ask for free food at restaurants and grocery stores so that they would not have to be seen asking for food. Many children dropped out of school. Not many went to college, so schools and colleges ran out of money and had to close. Being a child was not like it was in the 1920s when people had a lot of money. People got used to growing more food in their gardens. They did not throw away much food. They did not buy as much as stores. Most of the time, they made their own clothes. They had to find new ways to save money, like taking old shoes and putting cardboard in them when the bottoms of the shoes wore out. As many as 200,000 children lived alone with no family or home. Most children always heard, but people always heard about other families who suffered more than they did, including those with no houses, who had to live outside. The lives of women also changed. Some married women and mothers had to go to work to have enough money for their family. Many men did not like this. They thought that men should get the jobs first. Some men tried to keep companies from giving women jobs. More schools than before refused to let married women be teachers. 26 states passed laws that said married women could not be hired. But more women still got jobs, as many as 13 million during the Great Depression. Only 10 million had jobs outside of the home in the 1920s. Some women found jobs that men did not want to do, like they worked as telephone operators, social workers, and secretaries. Some worked as maids and cleaned houses for people who still had a lot of money. Next, let's talk about American farmers. From the turn of the century through much of World War I, farming in the Great Plains had made a lot of money due to very good weather, high prices for the food they grew, and government programs that encouraged people to buy a lot of land. As the U.S. government bought all the extra food that the farmers grew to feed the fighting men of World War I, farmers and ranchers did things that were not very smart, including taking money from banks. They promised to give back their farm to the bank if they could not pay the money back. They did the same thing for the food that they would grow in the future, so they would have more money to buy more land. But after World War I, the price of food fell quickly, especially during a recession in 1921. To pay back all the money they took from the banks, farmers tried to grow more food by having bigger farms. They turned native grassland into farmland to grow more and more wheat. They didn't care what this would do to the dirt. Still, the money that people would pay for the food they grew was less and less. Finally, in 1929, the price of wheat dropped from $2 to 40 cents a bushel. While factory workers lost their jobs and the money they had saved during the crash, many farmers also lost their homes because the banks tried to make the farmers pay back the money they had borrowed. Between 1930 and 1935, almost 750,000 farmers lost their farms because of this. Those who were still able to keep their farms had a very hard time selling the food they grew because workers who had lost their jobs didn't have much money to buy food. When they could, the price of food was so low that farmers almost did not have enough money to live on. They sometimes had to burn their own corn to stay warm in the winter. Making the problem worse was the loss of rain that began in 1931 and lasted for 8 terrible years. Huge clouds of dust rolled along the ground through the Great Plains. The dust made it hard to breathe, and it filled in doorways and came into homes through closed windows. Even more quickly than it had grown, the money from farming was lost because farmers grew too much food and used too much land. All of this created the Dust Bowl. Farm animals died or had to be sold as there was no money to buy food to feed them. Food grown to feed the family dried up because there was very little rain. Terrible dust storms happened more often. The dust created a new disease called dust pneumonia. In 1935 alone, over 850 million tons of dirt was blown away. Scientists said it would take 500 years for the Earth to grow back 1 inch of dirt that one big dust storm could blow away. Trying so hard to get more land to grow more food, farmers had destroyed what keeps the ground healthy. They did not know that they should use crop rotation, which is to grow different food on different pieces of land each year. They also did not let some fields lie fallow or be left unused in some years so the soil could recover. They worked the land to death. For farmers, the results were terrible. Unlike most factory workers in the city, usually farmers lost their homes when no one would buy the food they grew. Most farmers and ranchers borrowed money from small country banks that knew how the business of farming worked. As these banks failed, they often sold what they had to large banks in the cities. They did not care much about farm life. This included the promise that the farmers had made to pay back the money they borrowed. The farmers now had to pay the money they had borrowed from the small banks to the large banks. Since farmers did not have the money to pay back what they borrowed, the large banks took their farms. They also bought the small country banks. 5,000 banks closed between 1930 and 1932. More than 75% of them were country banks in areas where less than 2,500 people lived. So it is easy to see why farmers in the Great Plains still do not like to use big city banks. Even for farmers who got through the beginning of the crash and were not hurt too much by the dust storms, the situation still grew worse. The amount of people who could pay for their food was less and less. So farmers grew more food to try to make more money. But this made the problem worse. More food to buy made the cost go down even more. More and more farms failed, and farmers had to sell sell their farms at rock bottom prices. One farmer in Shelby, Nebraska, had borrowed $4,100 to run his farm and had to sell it for only $49.50. 1/4 of the farmland in the entire state of Mississippi was auctioned off in a single day in April 1932. Not all farmers tried to keep their land, especially those who had arrived only recently. Some just left their farms to the bank and did not pay back anything. In hard-hit Oklahoma, thousands of farmers did this. They took what they could and walked or drove away from the land that they thought was going to be their future. They became known as Okies. Okies were evidence of the failure of America's Great Plains to grow most of America's food. And their story was made famous in John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath. Many of the Okies drove to California along famous Route 66. Once there, they worked on large farms for very little money and lived just outside the farm in shacks or in camps without running water and toilets. Because of this, many people got sick. Next, let's look at how the Depression affected African Americans. Most African Americans did not buy a lot of land or put their money in the stock market like a lot of people did before the crash. Still, even though they usually did not do this, the Great Depression hit them very hard. Discrimination made it worse for African Americans. Farmers in the South who grew cotton had the same problems as farmers in other parts of the country. They had to pay their workers less or take away their jobs. Farmers would not let African Americans live on their land. Like other Americans, many African Americans lost their homes and jobs and any way to make money. In cities, African Americans did no better. There were very few jobs, and many white Americans felt that any available jobs should go to whites first. In some northern cities, whites would try to have African American workers fired to allow white workers to get their jobs. Jobs that were usually done by African Americans, such as cleaning the homes of rich people, were given to whites. By 1932, about 1/2 of all African Americans had no jobs. Attacks on African Americans happened more often. In the South, killing became more common, with 28 recorded hangings or lynchings in 1933, compared to 8 in 1932. Since towns and cities had enough problems of their own, and since it was difficult and took a long time to make sure that African Americans were treated the same as whites, many people decided that there was nothing they could do about the problem. They acted as though these problems were not real. But sometimes, something like a hanging was so terrible that the whole country heard about it. One such case was the Scottsboro Boys. In 1931, 9 black boys were put on trial for being homeless, breaking the law, and arguing with some white people on a train. 2 young white women, who had been dressed as boys and traveling with a group of white boys, said that the black boys had forced them to have sex with them against their wishes. The trial was in Scottsboro, Alabama. It really showed how much whites hated African Americans and how black people had not been treated fairly in America for many, many years. Even though they had not had sex with the women, and even though one of the women later said that it didn't happen, the all-white jury decided that the boys had really done these things, and all but one of them was sentenced to be put to death. The jury's decision forced Americans to look at how white people treated African Americans. Newspaper writers, college teachers, and those who fought for all people to be treated the same, especially in northern states, all said that black people were not being treated the same as whites. The trial was held over and over 3 times. Many courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, made decisions on the case, sometimes changing what other courts had decided. 2 important cases resulted from the Scottsboro Boys trial. Powell v. Alabama and Patterson v. Alabama found that people accused of crimes must have a chance to have a good lawyer, and lawyers cannot remove people from a jury just because of their race. In the end, the Scottsboro Boys were sent to prison for many years instead of being put to death. Finally, they were released. And in 2013, after they had died, they were pardoned by the state of Alabama for what people thought they had done. Let's continue by talking about labor unions. In 1932, a major strike at the Ford Motor Company factory near Detroit led to 60 people being hurt and 4 people losing their lives. Often called the Ford Hunger March, the event started as a planned demonstration by Ford workers who'd stopped working to let people know how desperate they were. They walked 9 miles from Detroit to Ford's River Rouge plant in the town of Dearborn. When they got there, Dearborn police shot tear gas at them, about 3,000 in all. They fought back by throwing stones and balls of dirt at the police. When they finally got to the Ford factory, police there started shooting at them, and firemen shot water at them. Besides those killed and injured, police put another 50 in jail. Many people said that this was police brutality. A week later, 60,000 people attended the public funerals of the 4 people who died. The event set the mood for worse relations between workers and companies in the nation. One of the most memorable events of the Depression had to do with veterans. Factory workers weren't the only people demonstrating in the 1930s. Demonstrations grew in Washington, D.C. as people thought that President Hoover was not doing anything about the Depression. The Depression, or the demonstration that drew the most notice, was the Bonus Army March of 1932. In 1924, Congress gave those who fought in World War I a piece of paper that they could use in 1945 to buy $1,000 worth of anything. By 1932, many of these World War I soldiers had lost their jobs and the money they'd saved. They asked Congress to let them spend this money or this bonus before 1945. As members of Congress talked about what to do, the Bonus Army built a town of shacks across the Potomac River and Anacostia Flats. When the Senate did not agree to let them spend their $1,000 before 1945, most of the unhappy Bonus Army people returned home, but several thousand stayed there with their families. Many of them had nowhere else to go. The Bonus Army people were calm and friendly and did not have guns or other weapons. However, many people thought that the country might not be safe with them there. On July 28th, police began to drive them out. 2 men were killed as tear gas and spears were used to make them leave. Afraid of more fighting, Hoover brought a large number of Army soldiers into the city. soldiers on the ground, on horses, and in tanks, General Douglas MacArthur was in charge. The people of the Bonus Army in Anacostia Flats had to run for their lives. Their shacks were then burned down by the army. Many Americans were really angry. How could the army act this way? 90% of the Bonus Army men had been soldiers in the Great War. It showed no respect for Americans who'd been in the army. Hoover said that the Bonus Army wanted to tear down the government and that most of them were communists. This was not true. 9 out of 10 bonus marchers had been soldiers, and 20% were disabled from the war. The Bonus Army was the largest march in Washington up to that time. Hoover and MacArthur thought that the Bonus Army people were much more dangerous than they really were. That summer, when Hoover tried to get people to vote for him again, they remembered that he'd sent the army against those who had fought for their country in World War I. Hoover could not get them to forget this. So far, we've been talking about specific groups of people like factory workers, African Americans, and veterans. But now we're going to look more generally at all those millions of Americans who lost their homes because of the Great Depression. Of these, many traveled around the country looking for work, often getting from one place to another by jumping onto trains. These travelers were known as hobos. We don't know exactly when hobos began using American trains to get around. At the end of the American Civil War in the 1860s, many soldiers returned home by riding on freight trains. Others looking for work on the American frontier rode freight trains going west in the late 1800s. In any case, riding the rails, as it was called, was very common by the time the Great Depression started. What was scary was that 250,000 of the hobos during the Depression were teenagers. Life as a hobo was dangerous. Hobos had no homes and were far away from people who cared about them. Those who worked on the trains did not like them and were mean to them. The train companies had their own police known as bulls. Bulls were known for hurting and killing people. Also, just riding on a train was dangerous. It was easy to get stuck between train cars and fall off. The smoke made it hard to breathe. Hobos on trains got too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. At least 6,500 hobos died each year, either from bulls or from accidents. So with all these Americans suffering, what did President Hoover do? Right after Black Tuesday, Hoover tried to make Americans feel better, saying that all was well. Reading his words now, it's easy to laugh at how wrong he was. In 1929, he said that it was silly not to believe in the strength of American business. In 1930, he said, the worst is behind us. In 1931, he promised that the U.S. would help out if he ever saw people sick or dying because of not enough food in the country. Hoover did not mean to be blind or not care. He just had strong ideas about how the government should be involved in the economy, and his ideas did not change as the problems of the Great Depression got worse. Hoover really thought that if American people took care of themselves, then their hard work would bring its own success. His own life had told him that this was true. His family was poor when he was born, but he found a way to go to college at Stanford University and finally made a lot of money as an engineer. This experience, plus his travels in China and throughout Europe, made him strongly believe that Americans could solve their problems by themselves if they just tried hard enough. He hated the idea of government helping individual Americans. Although people in Europe might need help, like getting enough food to eat during and after World War I, Hoover thought that the American people were stronger than that. In 1931, he said on the radio that more government help took away the need for people to work for themselves and destroyed the way of thinking that had made America great. Hoover also thought it might hurt the economy if people put too much money in the stock market. When he was Secretary of Commerce, Hoover often told this to President Coolidge. In the weeks before he became president, he talked to newspapers and magazines telling Americans that it would be a good idea if they cut back on all the money that they were putting into the stock market. He wanted the government to make it harder for banks to borrow money, to loan to people, so that it would be harder for them to buy more stocks. But he did not want to cause a panic either, so he never clearly warned people to stop buying so much stock. He did not want the government to control the stock market. His thoughts about this ran throughout the whole U.S. government while he was president. So Hoover tried to deal with the crash in two very common American ways. First, he asked people to spend less money and work harder. And second, he asked business leaders to keep workers on their jobs. He told business leaders that the crash was not part of a bigger problem and that they had nothing to worry about. He also got owners of railroad companies and utility companies to promise to spend billions of dollars on new construction projects. In return, workers and labor unions agreed not to demand higher pay. He got Congress to pass a law cutting taxes by $160 million so that workers could keep more of the money they earned. Overall, Hoover's ideas are called volunteerism because he wanted people and business owners to volunteer to do what was best to help the country. But this was not enough. By the end of 1931, Hoover knew that the economy would not get better without more help from the government. He created the President's Organization of Unemployment Relief, POOR. But POOR did not give money to the people in need. Instead, it gave money to groups like the Red Cross, Salvation Army, and Community Chest or United Way, so they could help people. He also asked people with lots of money to give some of their money to help the poor. He gave a lot of his own money and even raised money to help the poor. Congress wanted to give more government money to help, but Hoover refused. He did care about the problems of the poor, but he really thought that it was important that people should take care of themselves. He said that people helping themselves was way more important than the government doing it for them. Not able to get help from the US government, Americans turned to groups like the Red Cross, churches and synagogues, and states for help. These groups were not able to deal with such a huge problem. Like everyone else, they did not have much money. Cities could not help much either. In 1932, New York City was only able to give a family $2.39 a week, and only one half of the families even got that. Detroit only had enough money to give each person 15 cents a day, and then they ran out of money too. The most that could get done was to give people food and coal or gas to keep warm and run their cars. But there was no help for rent, clothes, medical care, or other things people needed. Old people who no longer were working had to have their adult children take care of them. Local groups such as the police and teachers tried to help those who needed the most help. They gave some of their own pay to help feed hungry people. In 1931, Chicago teachers used their own money to give food to 11,000 students. But even though many of them had not been paid for their work in months. In 1932, New York City teachers did the same thing. They gave as much as $250,000 a month from their own pay to help children in need. But this help was scattered across the country, could not help the many, many Americans who had no hope. Finally, in 1932, Hoover created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC. He gave $2 billion to help banks. He wanted people to trust in the banks again. But most of the money went to large banks, and not to small banks in the small towns where many people lived. It did not help much because people needed money to live on. They did not have much of their own money in their banks anyway. The Great Depression is truly a depressing story. So let's turn to something a little happier. The movies. In the 1920s, people thought it was important for people to be able to do things for themselves and get rich through competing with others. Books helped to tell the story, like Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. This idea was also seen in silent movies like Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. During the Depression, when people had so little money, you would think that people would not spend their money on going to the movies. But this was not true. Movies offered a way for Americans to think of better times, and people were willing to pay 25 cents for a chance to escape to the movies, at least for a few hours. Even the songs in the movies made people think of happier days. Two songs that were popular were We're in the Money and Happy Days Are Here Again. Franklin Roosevelt used that one when he was running for president in 1932. People wanted to forget their worries, enjoy the silly action of the Marx Brothers and the lively charm of Shirley Temple and the wonderful dancing of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. The 9 Hardy Boys films starring Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney showed that no matter what the challenge was, it could be solved by kids doing a musical play and bringing together families and friends in a warm display of community values. We're going to finish our story today by learning what happened to President Hoover. Without a doubt, Hoover was not at fault for the Great Depression. But while he was president and the country slipped more and more into problems for which there seemed to be no way out, he received the blame. People called the shanty towns Hoovervilles. People who had nothing to use to keep warm used newspapers to wrap up in. These became known as Hoover blankets. People needed to blame somebody, and many Americans said that Hoover was at fault. Running for president and under the slogan, rugged individualism, made it difficult for Hoover to push for the government to get involved in a big way to help the economy return to normal. In 1930, people who ran large American businesses talked Hoover into signing a new law called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. This law was supposed to protect American industry from competition from other countries by adding an extra charge to goods brought to the United States. The idea was that the extra charge would make foreign-made products more expensive, and people would then buy things made in America. It was passed against the advice of nearly every person who studied economics at the time. It was the largest extra charge or tariff on foreign-made products in American history. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff was a huge mistake. Instead of helping American manufacturers, it hurt them when other nations responded with tariffs of their own. As people around the world stopped buying American-made goods, the entire world went into a depression. Nearly anyone could have beaten Hoover and vote for president in 1932. New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the Democratic Party's choice to be president. He promised a new deal for the American people. The Republican Party chose Hoover again to be their president, perhaps because there were so few people in the Republican Party who wanted to be president. Roosevelt was born in 1882, the son of a rich New York factory owner. Roosevelt was the fifth cousin of the famous president Theodore Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR as he was called, became involved in politics at a young age. Strong backer of former President Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, Roosevelt ran for vice president in 1920, but lost. The following year, he got polio, and even though it didn't kill him, like it did many other Americans who had the terrible disease, he could never walk again without crutches to hold himself up. The election was a huge win for the Democratic Party. 58% of the people voted for Roosevelt. He also won 89% of the electoral vote. This was the second worst loss for the Republican Party in their history. Bands across America started playing Roosevelt's theme song, "Happy Days Are Here Again." The American president gave new hope to Americans all across the country. That was quite a long lesson, so before we go, let's review the big ideas we learned. The Great Depression affected everyone. Even people who did not lose their jobs usually had their pay lowered. Hungry, jobless, homeless Americans became a common sight on the streets of American cities. Families were hit especially hard. Divorce and separation increased, birth rates fell, more women began looking for work in order to support their families. Many children dropped out of school. Farmers who had bad loans from the 1920s lost their farms as banks foreclosed. In the middle of the country, a drought and poor farming techniques combined to form the Dust Bowl. People whose farms had been ruined by the dust fled to California and elsewhere looking for a chance to start over. The Depression was especially hard for African Americans. The few jobs that were available were given to whites first. In some places, anger and frustration boiled over and African Americans were attacked. Organized labor suffered during the Great Depression. In Detroit, hungry workers marched to a Ford factory and clashed violently with police. In Washington, D.C., an army of World War I veterans gathered to demand early payment of a bonus. President Hoover ordered their camp cleared. It was a decision that cemented his unpopularity. Millions of Americans were left homeless. Many rode the rails looking for work, which was dangerous. Among these, tens of thousands were teenagers. During the Depression, Americans loved going to the movies. It was a chance to escape the hardships of daily life. President Hoover tried to fix the problem, but he thought people and businesses should volunteer to help each other instead of having the government fix things for them. He went to churches shelters, soup kitchens to help the poor. This didn't work because the Depression was so bad. In 1932, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt won the presidential election. He promised voters a New Deal. Thank you for watching. In our next lesson, we're going to learn about Roosevelt and his New Deal. I'll see you then.
I had to pack up and go, and I just blowed in, and I'll soon blow out again.